From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Monday, December 22nd, 2014. Two NYPD police officers are killed in an incident that has prompted the police union of accusing protesters of having blood on their hands. We'll speak with activists with the group Black Lives Matter about what the incident means, why the Ferguson Grand Jury was allowed to hear from fraudulent witnesses, and much more. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Now, President Obama, in an interview on CNN yesterday, said the U.S. is considering putting North Korea back on its list of state sponsors of terrorism over the recent Sony hacking controversy. The president labeled the incident one of cyber vandalism, which does not rise to the level of an act of war or terrorism. At the heart of the matter is a Sony film project depicting an assassination attempt against North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, which the hackers targeted. The film's release has now been cancelled. The North Korean regime has responded, saying it is not responsible for the cyber attack, and even claimed it has evidence that the White House was behind it. In a statement, the North Korean government referred to the U.S. as a, quote, cesspool of terrorism. China, which says it opposes all such attacks, has come to the defense of North Korea, considered a major ally. Well, Rahul, this cyber attack targeted a private corporation, not the U.S. government. And the whole world knows that the U.S. government spies on everyone, including foreign governments. How hypocritical has the response been from the White House?
Well, so let's be clear that this is a little bit more than a matter of spying, because they did actually extensive vandalism to Sony's IT infrastructure, among other things. So this was, whoever did this was an attack that rose beyond the level just of surveillance. But to talk about terrorism, as many people have, and as you know, thankfully the White House is not ready to go quite that far, is really kind of a ridiculous overreach. I mean, if the Sony hack is terrorism, then what is the constant regime of drone strikes in Pakistan? I mean, if we're being deprived of our right to go and watch what seems to be an extremely stupid and probably racist movie, which is, you know, a right that we all should be free to exercise, then what do we talk about depriving others of the right to enjoy a blue sky, as is the case in many places that the United States regularly drones?
Right. And the Department of Defense on Saturday announced it has returned 4 Afghan prisoners to their home country. It was the first time inmates from Guantanamo were repatriated to Afghanistan, and the move was apparently in response to a request by newly seated President Ashraf Ghani. Earlier this month, the U.S. released 6 other prisoners into the custody of Uruguay. There are now 63 men remaining at Guantanamo. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the horrific armed attack on a school that left 132 children dead has sparked public support for a return to the death penalty. After a 6-year moratorium against capital punishment, Pakistan's government has been rapidly executing death row prisoners, including ones who had no connection to the recent attack. Among those whose executions are planned is a young man who was arrested when he was only 14 years old. He says he was tortured into confessing to a kidnapping and a murder. Rahul, has the U.S. sort of set the standard for how poorly governments respond these days to acts of terrorism?
Well, you know, I think lots of governments are capable of coming up with more response on their own. But in the case of Pakistan, it's important to remember we're talking a tutelage, a very direct tutelage in dealing with issues like this that's more like 35 years long, not just the period since 9/11. In fact, it was the United States support for the worst dictator in Pakistani history, Zia-ul-Haq, during the 80s, because of its war, its proxy war in Afghanistan, that's set the ball rolling on all of these things. Right now, the situation in Pakistan is, I think, extreme, and the Taliban made a really big mistake if they ever want to have a cessation of hostilities in attacking basically the children of the Pakistani military. It looks like we're in for more escalation.
And finally, here in the United States, Undocumented immigrants in Arizona will begin today to be able to apply for driver's licenses after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take up a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision overturning Governor Jan Brewer's license ban. Up to 20,000 immigrants are now eligible for licenses in Arizona. These are young immigrants who qualified under President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which temporarily protects them from deportation. California has already been issuing licenses to undocumented immigrants for more than a year. Rahul, do these legal decisions by courts coming in the wake of Obama's recent executive action signal a softening of the nation's position overall on immigrants?
Well, I don't think so. I think that what the signal is primarily the way that the Supreme Court and the courts are likely to look at these things. So the actual decision allowing these based on equal protection. If some immigrants with work permits can get licenses, why should other immigrants with work?
We're having some trouble hearing your audio, Rahul. If you can maybe just start over real quick.
I think that what this really signals is how courts, including the Supreme Court, are going to treat it more than what public opinion is going to be like. You know, this decision was based on equal protection. Basically, the idea was if some immigrants with work permits can get driver's licenses, why shouldn't other immigrants with work permits be able to get them too? And I think that kind of equal protection is certainly going to be upheld by the court. That is a general defense of federal prerogative. This was a state versus federal kind of issue. And the last thing to remember, I think, is that the Republican Party itself is somewhat split. I mean, the masses, the grassroots are firmly anti-immigration now, but the business wing of the Republican Party, dwindling as it is still has a very different position.
Well, Rahul Mahajan, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The killings this weekend of two New York Police Department officers by a man claiming revenge for the deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown has kicked off a firestorm among law enforcement officials. An African-American man named Ismail Brinsley killed a woman on Saturday who is believed to have been his ex-girlfriend before shooting into a police car, killing officers Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos, and then killing himself. Before the shootings, Brinsley reportedly boasted on social media sites that he was going to kill cops. Police union leaders instantly blamed anti-police brutality protesters, Mayor Bill de Blasio, Reverend Al Sharpton, and even President Barack Obama for the incident. Patrick Lynch, the head of the police union, said there was blood on many hands. Lynch also said in a statement, quote, "We have for the first time in a number of years become a wartime police department. We will act accordingly." The killings came within days of the revelation by St. Louis County Prosecutor Robert McCulloch that some witnesses who testified to the grand jury deciding whether or not to charge Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown may have lied. In an interview, McCulloch said, quote, "Clearly some were not telling the truth." His statements refer to witness number 40, a woman named Sandra McElroy, who apparently has a history of racist remarks, criminal behavior, and mental illness. She was considered a key witness in the decision to not indict Wilson, and Wilson's supporters have often cited her testimony. It now turns out McElroy simply parroted media reports of what Wilson said happened. Mr. McCulloch, however, said he had neither regrets about calling non-credible witnesses to the stand, nor any plans to prosecute them for lying under oath. As the battle between people and police ramps up, we turn today to the co-founder of one of the leading organizations in the fight to hold police accountable. My guest is Patrisse Cullors, who, in addition to fellow organizers Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, founded the group Black Lives Matter. She's also the founder of the organization Dignity and Power Now. She's an artist and an activist and a Fulbright Scholarship recipient. She was named the 2007 Mario Savio Activist of the Year. She received the Sidney Goldfarb Award and earned a degree in religion and philosophy from UCLA. Now, she's been on the ground in both Ferguson and St. Louis, providing support to activists, and has helped to organize hundreds of people in a freedom ride from St. Louis to Ferguson. Also with me in studio is Jasmine Richards. She's born and raised in Pasadena, California, and is an active member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, currently working to build a chapter in Pasadena. I'm very pleased to welcome both of you in studio this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, so much to discuss. First, let's talk about the police killings this weekend. Your organization, Black Lives Matter, released a statement saying, among other things, an eye for an eye is not our vision for justice. What do you make of the police union so quickly blaming protesters for what happened? I'm sure Patrick Lynch would say, you have blood on your hands.
We think it's deeply unfortunate. You know, I think a lot of our community has called for peace during this time. And oftentimes when Black people are murdered by the police, the first thing we call for is peace. And we see the opposite happening with the police union. Two of their own were murdered, and the first thing they're saying is it's wartime. And we think that's unfortunate, and we think that it's a pretty drastic decision to make for people who've been large in part peacefully protesting in the streets of New York and across the country.
New York in particular right now seems to have turned into a sort of second major flashpoint in addition to Ferguson. I mean, there are so many around the country, of course, but seeing what has unfolded in New York, essentially the statement that Patrick Lynch's organization, the union, released said that police officers have to act as though it's the 1970s when, quote, police officers were ambushed and executed on a regular basis. First of all, I'm not sure if that is true.
Right.
And second of all, it's giving the impression that police officers are under a sort of siege. But I was looking up that logging, fishing, driving a cab, trash collecting, farming, and truck driving are actually more dangerous than being a cop. And about half of all police who die on the job die in traffic accidents. It is pretty unusual for police to be killed like this, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, our communities understand that if you shoot law enforcement, there is, or if you even try to abuse law enforcement, that there is sort of intense reactions towards us. So it's not
disproportionate usually.
Yes, yeah. And it's not often that that's something that we do. And I think it's really important. You know, someone wrote on their Twitter timeline that that it's really unfortunate that Black folks and protesters have to sort of apologize for this individual's act. And at the end of the day, we are going to still be chanting Black Lives Matter. At the end of the day, every 28 hours, a Black person is murdered by law enforcement. And so that's still true, even given the events of the last couple, these last couple days. And the last thing I'll say is, it's really unfortunate that the families had to lose their loved ones. I mean, just sort of like baseline, it's really unfortunate. And so our hearts grieve for the families. And we think that it's a time for all of us to continue to march and to continue to have our message that Black Lives Matter.
And you know, and when you were saying that people have bent over backwards right away to say that they grieve for the families of these police officers, we don't hear police unions saying similar statements, grieving for the families of people that police have killed, even if they sometimes, you know, the shooters might express regret, saying that it was terrible and they wish that it didn't have to happen. We don't hear, as an institution like your organizations, we don't hear similar organizations, a counterpart of police, saying this. Jasmine, any thoughts on that? I mean, it's pretty unfortunate, I think, that we're having to be put in this manner, to be put in this position. I'm wondering what you make of the racial dynamics of this incident. That it was a Black shooter who killed a Latino and an Asian officer, and then of course Patrick Lynch, the officers' union head, coming out and saying that this was an attack on all police officers. Are the racial dynamics here relevant?
I think they're relevant, but I actually think where we're missing in the conversation is the fact that he shot his girlfriend before he shot two cops. So before there were two cops that were murdered, there was actually someone who was shot. She didn't actually die. She's in critical condition. Her name's Shanika Thompson. that her name just was revealed yesterday. She's stable but in critical condition, and no one's talking about her. No one's saying, no one's talking about domestic violence. No one's talking about domestic abuse. And we want to sort of pivot our conversation to what about her? Her
Right.
Black Life matters as well.
And I appreciate you correcting the error that I made in my introduction. And, you're right, absolutely right. And I want to have this whole conversation around Black women's lives, which I know that your organization has done a lot of work on. Let's talk about the fact that the cops are also asking for protesters to stop protesting until the funerals of these two police officers. How do you respond to that?
What do you think about that, Jasmine?
I don't know how to feel about that. That's like, how do you tell somebody to be quiet because they're hurting? How do you tell people to stifle their voices? For them to even say that goes to show that Black lives doesn't matter to them. So we should stay out here and keep marching.
Now, just before the killings of the two NYPD officers, there was an incident in New York City where a large contingent of pro-police protesters stormed City Hall wearing T-shirts saying, "I can breathe," clearly mocking the last words of Eric Garner. Another group of pro-police protesters started this phrase of this one person who basically printed up T-shirts that said, "Breathe easy, don't break the law." How provocative are these acts and these actions?
They're actually really terrible. And it didn't start in New York because, as we know, many of the Ferguson Police Department had "I am Darren Wilson"
Right, absolutely.
on their wrists. They also, a lot of Darren Wilson advocates started saying "hands up, don't loot."
Yes.
Right? So there's sort of this like mockery that has happened of protesters and Black people in particular during this time. And to mock, I think, Eric Garner's last words, I mean, he died saying, "I can't breathe." And to put it on a T-shirt and say, "I can breathe." And I saw the image of those law enforcement officers, which were smiling, like this is a joke. And I can't help but sort of remember the images I've seen of lynch mobs smiling as Black people are dying. And so there's this connection that I think we need to make around how racism, part of what racism does is mocks Black death and sort of laughs at it. And I think we're seeing that with police and police unions and not taking these calls and these cries seriously.
It was just a few weeks after Michael Brown's killing that Isabel Wilkerson, writing in The Guardian, had a piece entitled "Mike Brown's Shooting and Jim Crow Lynchings Have Too Much in Common." She wrote, quote, "The rate of police killings of Black Americans is nearly the same as the rate of lynchings in the early decades of the 20th century. Are enough people making these connections?
I don't think so. I do think so. I think that Black Lives Matter, Ferguson Action, I think groups in St. Louis, groups in New York, we are making those connections. And I think mainstream media is not talking about this. They're not comparing lynchings and the conversations around Black people dying in the hands of police right now. But I think it's part of the public dialogue and part of public discourse.
Now, a few days before these killings of these two cops took place, another huge piece of news around the anti-police brutality protests and the movement that's been building and building is this incredible news that a grand jury witness named Sandra McElroy lied under oath, and this was a key testimony that was likely a base for why Darren Wilson was not indicted. Why hasn't this gotten more attention? I mean, this is kind of shocking.
I think it's simple. Bob McCullough never planned on indicting Darren Wilson, and it was very clear in his statement of the non-indictment. He could have just said, "We're not indicting him." He gave 20 minutes. He gave like a 20-minute speech as to why he decided he wasn't going to indict Darren Wilson and all the reasons why, they looked at all the evidence. And then to come out and say, "Well, I did know that she was a liar, and it's still not that serious, and I still agree with my decision." It's clear that he never, in his mind, was going to convict or going to indict him, because it's not even a conviction.
Right.
And I also think the other piece is the state of Missouri and the city of St. Louis is extremely racist. And I don't think I understood that until I went. And Jasmine could talk about her trip to St. Louis. We just spoke about it this weekend at Pasadena Town Hall she hosted. But the level of racism and sort of in-your-face racism that exists in the county of St. Louis is nothing I ever experienced in my life living in California and Los Angeles. And yeah, and so I think there's that huge piece that the way racism plays out in St. Louis is similar to how it played out in the 50s in the South.
Jasmine, tell us about your trip to Ferguson.
Okay. My trip to Ferguson, we got on two vans, 36 hours. We went through Texas, Illinois. No.
And this was in the summer, just after Mike Brown's killing?
Yeah, like in August. I've never experienced racism like traveling through these states. I got to see racism for its pure and rawest form, in its pure and rawest form. I found out that California is full of racism, but no racist.
What do you mean by that?
It's under the table. It's not in your face like everywhere else, but it's still here. And once I came back, I got to see it, and I realize it, and it's in my face now because now I know what to look for. And Ferguson actually changed my life. Black Lives Matter changed my life because it showed me that my life matters. At a critical time when I didn't think my life mattered, and a lot of my friends, they don't think their lives matter as well. So Ferguson was just an eye-opening experience.
And when you were there, the connections that you made on the ground, that the two of you made with activists there, because that's another thing that's really crucial. The police have tried to, or did try to make it seem as though everybody who was protesting in Ferguson were outsiders. And then in New York, people were saying, well, everyone who's in New York is actually from Ferguson. But what did you make of, or what sort of connections did you make with local activists on the ground? Because there's some incredible people doing incredible work on the ground in Ferguson.
I met some really cool people. Dante, he's from Lost Voices. Well, now it's called Found Voices. He's just like me. He was a kid from the neighborhood. He used to gang bang. He was a troubled kid. And he's using his voice now. He's using his voice to fight. And he has tattoos on his face. So he's not your average organizer, but he's incredible. Tef Poe, he was an incredible guy. There's just so many amazing people out there. I even got to do some interviews with some people out there. And they said that they weren't looting and they weren't messing up things to take them. They were looting. I mean, they were burning stuff and messing things up so people could pay attention. So CNN could pay attention because that's the only way a black life would matter, is if you mess up some stuff and go crazy. And they said that they stayed there so long because they were scared that the police were going to put a gun on them, plant a gun.
Wow.
So what you see on TV is not really what it is. And it's not their true intentions, it's not their hearts. I don't know if you know this or not, but the police would not let Mike Brown's mother put a sheet over her son's body. And they told her to get the fuck back. We don't care who.
We actually can't. We need to not curse on the air.
They told her to get
back. That's okay. So then tell us a little bit. So continue your story. So basically, the police disrespected her.
Yeah, they disrespected her. They just told her to get back, and that made me question people's humanity, because if you can't put yourself in her shoes as far as you're black, she's white, put yourself in her shoes as far as she's a mother, and that's not in the natural order of life. So for people to be laughing at people getting killed and these mothers hurt, I'm questioning everyone's humanity.
Now, let's step back and talk, Patrisse, about the organization Black Lives Matter. It's not something that just started this summer. You and your fellow organizers, Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza, started this organization, 2 years ago?
Last year.
Oh, last year,
after
okay.
After George Zimmerman acquittal.
And so where did that, how did you come up with this phrase? What are the origins of this phrase that has now become a rallying cry among a few other rallying cries, such as Hands Up, Don't Shoot, and I Can't Breathe?
Yep. So Trayvon Martin was murdered, and George Zimmerman was not arrested at first, and then he was arrested after the family really pushed for the Florida Police Department to arrest him. And then we waited to see what was going to happen, if he was going to be convicted of murder. And we witnessed Trayvon Martin go on trial. We witnessed his character be slandered. And the day of the verdict, which was July 13th, a Saturday, I was in Susanville. I was visiting one of my mentees at the state prison. And I came home and I went on Facebook. There was no TV in the motel room. And folks on Facebook started to say he was acquitted. And I just lost it. I was crying and disturbed. And I was like, if we have all this evidence that this young man was hunted by George Zimmerman, and yet George Zimmerman still gets off the hook, well, what does our lives mean, right?
Yeah. And in many ways, then these young men and women like Trayvon Martin, like Mike Brown and Eric Garner symbolize like all our children.
Precisely. And yes, exactly. And I think for me, it was just this intense amount of grief that came over me. But I'm also an organizer, and so I quickly moved my grief into action.
Don't mourn, organize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I moved my grief into action, and I just started going on social media and writing Black people and saying that I love them and checking on other Black people. How are you? And myself and Alicia got into a Facebook sort of conversation. And she said this thing where she essentially said to Black folks in particular who were saying, we should have known better. Of course, they were going to treat us this way. She started saying to folks, I'm always going to be surprised. I'm never going to let them numb me from saying that our lives don't matter. And she said, our lives matter, Black lives matter. And then under the Facebook thread, I hashtagged Black Lives Matter. And so from there, literally in that moment, it was like a light bulb for so many Black people on social media at that point. And I started tagging Black folks saying, your life matters, Black lives matter, and started tagging all my Black friends. I got on the phone with her that night, and we said we want this to be a project. And so the very next day on July, it was a couple days later, July 15th, Rico Matsuda from Flip the Script here called me on to be on a show, and I was going to talk about Black Lives Matter. So it happened very organically. Soon enough, Alicia was on HuffPo Live talking about Black Lives Matter. We ended up seeing Law & Order did a whole segment, a weird mashup of Trayvon Martin and Paula Deen. And there was a protest. It was very weird. But someone had a Black Lives Matter sign in the protest. And so we knew that it was doing something out in the world for Black folks. We did a huge protest in Beverly Hills, where we shut down Beverly Hills a few days after Trayvon, the acquittal of George Zimmerman. We had all these Black Lives Matter signs. And so I think both the hashtag blew up on social media, but also blew up in the streets. And we saw lots of folks sort of holding these signs and utilizing them in their cities. And then fast forward, Mike Brown's murdered. And then I think St. Louis and Ferguson really took the Black Lives Matter piece to the next level. We have our Black Lives Matter ride where we organize over 600 people, and all those folks go back to their communities and continue Black Lives Matter in their own city.
How do you make, or what do you make of the response by some who are upset at this movement emerging and who retort, well, all lives matter? There was an article in the Huffington Post this weekend by an ex-NYPD cop entitled, about the police killings, entitled Blue Bleeds Too, All Lives Matter.
We think it's a lazy response. We think that if all lives matter, you will fight like heck for Black lives. That's what we say. And right now in our history, Black folks are not just under attack by law enforcement, but we're in poverty. We have the highest homelessness. Black women have the highest eviction rates. Black folks are suffering through and through. And if there are no programs looking at Black suffering, then how are we going to ensure that Black folks actually live our lives versus just try to survive them?
Jasmine, you said earlier that this movement and even this phrase, Black Lives Matter, had changed your life. How do you see yourself moving forward as somebody taking this slogan?
I see myself going to city, letting people know that their lives matter. We did a protest out on King, and we did a march. And I went to the sides because there were people like in the community, but they were in their houses. So I went to their houses and I said, come out into the streets. You know, this is our neighborhood. So there was a kid and his father. And his father, I told him and his son to come out. So then I gave the son the bullhorn. And I said, did you know your life matters? And he looked at me, he said, my life matters? And I said, your dad's life matters too. And he started screaming it. He says, my life matters. My dad's life matters. And to the point where the whole crowd, everyone just started feeding into it, like, my life matters, our life matters. And it's like, we need to know that. It's so simple to so many people, like, yeah, all life matters. But until you're shot down, gunned down, until you have to get pulled over and take off your socks and your shoes and sit there like a common criminal, then we'll start saying all lives matter. But until then, we're going to focus on our lives because we don't know that.
I want to remind our listeners and our viewers that I'm speaking with Patrisse Cullors and Jasmine Richards of Black Lives Matter. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Do stay with us. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You've been listening to and watching a discussion on the emerging movement on an issue that has lasted for as long as this country has existed. And that is police brutality, state violence against African Americans, and the emerging movement that is gaining more and more steam now, that is organizing under the banner of Black Lives Matter and many other slogans. And joining me in studio for the hour is one of the co-founders of that organization, Patrisse Cullors, along with Jasmine Richards, who is working on starting a chapter of the organization in Pasadena, where she is from. So let's talk about the fact that many people are picking up this phrase, Black Lives Matter. Some of them unlikely. For example, Hillary Clinton recently actually came out and said Black Lives Matter. I mean, she's likely and very obviously campaigning for president, but she said something, you know, she for her to say that, for somebody like her in her position to say that, how important was that? And do you even take her seriously when she says that?
You know, I think I come from teachings that we have to win the battle of ideas. And when we first came up with the slogan Black Lives Matter, most people were uncomfortable with it, including Black people. And because we live in a culture where we don't talk about Blackness. We all know racism exists, right? Some states, there's sort of more visible racism, but no one wants to use the word Black. And so as we pushed it, and I think really in this last few months, it sort of took off. You know, the day of the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, it was tweeted 150,000 times.
Wow.
So, and since then it's been tweeted over 1 million times. And I think that's actually significant. And it's now in pop culture that Black Lives Matter. It reminds me of a Time magazine that I have when Angela Davis was on trial. And she was on the cover of Time, right? That's popular culture. And so we're in this moment where Black lives are now in popular culture, and I think that's important. But it doesn't end there. That's sort of like shallow pop culture. So for Hillary Clinton to say Black Lives Matter, she wasn't the first politician. You know, Mayor de Blasio said it after the non-indictment of the officer that murdered Eric Garner. And that was sort of like a little bit of shock. He's like, Black lives do matter. And we all sort of looked around like, oh no, this could be good or really bad. The co-opting of Black Lives Matter. So I think Hillary Clinton saying it is an important step in how we have this larger conversation. But we know that the Clinton administration ruined welfare. We know that they, really pushed hard on the war on drugs. And so that have deeply impacted Black lives. So for Hillary to say Black Lives Matter, sure, I think it's an important step, but will she actually care about Black life is a whole nother conversation.
Now, let's talk about some of the short-term fixes that government officials have brought up, and then a long-term vision for what you and other activists would like to see. So the short-term issues, one is simply keeping track of people being killed.
Yes.
You would think that this would be a given. How many people are killed by police across the country every year? And it appeared that the federal government does not keep records, or did not keep records. Apparently, Congress did, however, pass a law very recently, very quietly,
Yes.
to keep track of police killings. It was called the Death in Custody Reporting Act, requiring the states to report numbers to the Justice Department and analyze them. And then the U.S. Attorney General has 2 years to analyze the data and determine if and how it can be used to reduce such deaths. How important is this record keeping? I mean, is it just a small reform?
It's significant.
Okay.
Right now, law enforcement in general is not obligated to submit their reports of who they've killed and their department who's been murdered. It's voluntary. Right now, they send it to the FBI. And I think there's only 17,000 departments that actually send in their reports. And then of those reports, we've seen in the statistic that 20 Black men are 20 times more likely to be murdered. And that's just from voluntary, putting in their reports voluntarily. And I think this is a huge first step.
To just show the disparity in numbers,
exactly,
right?
Just show the disparity. But we want to take it a step further. We actually want to have, whether it's a bill or resolution passed, that local law enforcement, if there should be some criteria, right? So if you're using too much force, if there's too many, deadly force, there should be some actual consequences, and we think it should be monetary consequences. We really want to push on what would it look like to lower funding of law enforcement agencies. They're given millions and sometimes billions of dollars to run their departments.
They're also being given millions of dollars to wear body-worn cameras, and this is being touted as a magic bullet. Jasmine, I don't know if you have an opinion on body-worn cameras. I mean, certainly the more cameras we can aim at police officers, the better, as we now know that seeing these incidents like we haven't really been able to see before, except with the exception of perhaps Rodney King. But this is police officers training their cameras on you, and some people are sort of worried that it's even more surveillance.
Yeah.
Actually, I want them to have cameras on because we need somebody else to be seeing what's going on. You know what I mean?
So you think it's one good step?
Yeah.
And Patrisse, what's your opinion on body-worn cameras?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think on the one hand, it's important that police officers are being viewed, and that the department is actually keeping data of what's happening visually. But on the other hand, there are huge issues around surveillance. There are huge issues, like, say, police officers are eating lunch, and you happen to walk into the restaurant, and they turn on their camera. Is that legal? I mean, for them to sort of like watch you while you're eating, or
and they could also conveniently forget to turn them on when they are in an altercation.
Precisely. So I think it's complicated, and it's sort of I think it's an important step, but it's definitely not the magic bullet.
Right. So let's talk about the need for police in our society. There was one person in these last few months who heads a police department who sort of seemed to take a different approach, and that's Richmond, California's Chris Magnus, who picked up a sign. He was wearing his uniform, picked up a Black Lives Matter sign, and stood with protesters. He's apparently taken a different approach, working with the community in Richmond. And he's a white guy, and there's crime rates apparently have lowered under his watch. Does he represent a sort of even a slightly different model to policing?
I think so. I mean, I think
he's, by the way, come under a lot of fire for doing.
Yes, the union was very upset with him, and then I think he had a great response. When does people? What he said something like when is it? What did he say? Something around. When is it political to say someone's life matters? I thought that was beautiful. I thought that was such a beautiful response to the union. I think his approach is important. It shows that law enforcement can actually change the course of how law enforcement has behaved.
They don't have to be at war with us.
They don't have to be at war with us. They can actually stand up and fight for people's lives. And so I think I actually applaud. You know, there's a lot of people sort of side-eyeing him like, well, I don't know how we feel about
What's
a
your
cop.
story?
Yeah, I don't know how we feel about a cop holding a sign with Black Lives Matter. But I actually think that when the union responded in his response to him, it made me have a lot of respect for him. And I think he's being really courageous in this moment.
Jasmine, what would you like to see the role of police be in your neighborhood? You live in Pasadena. We know the story of Kendrick McDade, who was shot by police. No charges ever against the police?
No.
Yeah.
There weren't any charges. They just paid his mom, but that would never bring her son back. One thing that I want to see go on with the police in Pasadena is they need to do like a year of psychiatric evaluations. They need to
Of their officers?
Yes, they need to, before they become a police officer, they need a year of psychiatric evaluation. Then they need to do a year after that. They need to go into the neighborhood and do volunteer work. Not get paid yet, but just do volunteer work. Get to know where you're at, because you take police officers from Beverly Hills or from Thousand Oaks, and then you bring in the Watts. That's culture shock. You know what I mean? That's like
They're going to have a siege mentality.
Exactly. So they need to be able to get in that neighborhood and know
So
people.
they need to form bonds with the community,
Yes.
so that it's seen as their community.
Yes. Like police officers used to do, like when they first started, like the Irish police, before phones and things like that, they had to get to know the neighborhood, get to know the community, so they could be able to get information. So that's what they need to go back to.
There are some who say that, well, if we had a society where everybody was taken care of, where we addressed very strongly head-on issues of poverty and inequality, that the need for police itself would, become much less and possibly vanish. How do you respond to that, Patrisse? I mean, they sound radical, but...
I mean, police are part of a larger apparatus, which is called the prison industrial complex, right? There's policing, surveillance, and incarceration, and police feed this mass incarceration machine. And we don't talk about that often when we talk about state violence, but I think it's actually really important. And the organization that I run here in Los Angeles, Dignity and Power Now, we just won civilian oversight of the Sheriff's Department. We've been fighting that for 2.5 years. And we think it's part of a broader conversation around how do you end state violence. Well, one, how do you actually have a broader conversation about state violence? Putting a human being in a cage is state violence. Handcuffing someone, beating someone up, killing someone is state violence. And I think that the ways in which we've seen policing in the last 30 years of my life has been nothing but wreaking havoc on communities. Communities that are large in part suffering from poverty, lots of drug addiction, lots of violence, but that could be remedied in totally different ways, like mental health centers, like green space, like jobs. And so I think we've had this conversation a lot in Black Lives Matter. What would it look like to take just half of a police budget and put it in our neighborhood? Jasmine asked a great question at the Pasadena Town Hall. What would you do with $1 million of the police budget? Asked the folks at the town hall, and some folks were like, what? And then it took a moment. People were like, well, actually, these are all the things we would do with that money.
Now, you brought up the issue of mental health centers. How police deal with the mentally ill is a huge problem. And many of our prisons have turned into holding pens for people who are suffering from mental illness. But this is an issue that the Supreme Court is currently taking up as we speak. They are deciding on how to rule on whether police officers have an obligation under the Americans for Disabilities Act to accommodate people with mental illnesses when making arrests. Apparently, a woman who has mental illness was shot at by police. She survived, and she's claiming that her rights under the ADA were violated. And I am thinking constantly of this young man, Kajim Powell, in Ferguson, just weeks after Mike Brown was killed, whose killing by police officers was caught on camera. They say he was talking to himself. They say he had a knife. and they just shot him, and nothing has come of that incident. No one's talking about it. How important is this issue of how police interact with the mentally ill?
Oh, it's huge. Well, first of all, police should not be the first responders for the mentally ill. And if they are the first responders, there should be a significant amount of training that goes into what it means to be a first responder. Folks who have mental illness, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where they're having delusions, when someone's yelling at them to put their hands up and they're giving them multiple instructions, all through yelling, is actually they're not going to listen to that. They're not going to see and understand what that is. To de-escalate someone who is suffering from mental illness, it takes a significant amount of work and a lot of training. And so I think that right now, currently, Ezell Ford here in Los Angeles, he was known for having mental illness, and the police officers knew him, and they shot him anyways. So obviously, I would say the first thing is police should not be first responders for mentally ill, and if that is the case, there should be a significant amount of training.
Now, the movement, the sort of high points of this emerging movement have focused on Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, but we don't perhaps know the names of Rekia Boyd and Renisha McBride and Ayanna Jones as well. Do you think that that's a problem, that the women, the black women who are killed by law enforcement, maybe not getting killed in as high numbers as black men, but are still... their lives are mattering too?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I think about Ayanna Jones almost every day, 7 years old, sleeping in her home, and was murdered by police. The police officer is under the third trial. They just reinstated his trial. It's been 2 hung juries. And the fact that we don't know her name, I think is actually tragic. And part of the conversation around Black Lives Matter, when we say Black Lives Matter, we say all Black Lives Matter. And there isn't sort of a prototype of what we mean by Black life. And we know that Black women are impacted by state violence. We know that Black trans folks are impacted by state violence. And this is a necessary conversation. And the only way we're going to remember these folks' names is if we keep saying them. People didn't know. Rodney King's name was just one name, but Rodney King was of many Black people who'd been brutalized by LAPD. And so we have to keep saying their names, and so that people can see that their lives matter.
And in fact, women like the two of you have really been on the forefront of this struggle in California, in Ferguson, Missouri, in New York. And how significant is that? How important is that?
It's real important to me. It's my purpose. It's allowing me to give back to my community. It's allowing me to show my nephews and my nieces that your lives matter, that it's okay if you mess up in life. Just try. Just put one foot forward and keep on trying,
And we know that if you're white, you're allowed to mess up. But if you're Black in particular, then you don't get those chances.
Exactly.
Especially starting in school. We talk about in some cases, the preschool to prison pipeline these days, not just the school to prison pipeline.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the fact that women are larger part on the front lines is tremendous and huge. And I also say that women have always been on the front lines. I think they said something like during the civil rights movement was 60% women, 40% men. But that's
amazing.
not how it's portrayed at all. Right. And so I think this generation of organizers, activists, we are saying, you're not going to erase us. You're not going to make us invisible. It's not just black women, it's also Black queer women on the front lines.
And you bring that up on your website very front and center.
Yeah.
And that's really important as well. Tell us about, and you mentioned violence against trans people, especially in the Black community. Again, another thing we don't hear much about or talk much about. How important is that?
It's huge. There have been 12 murders of trans women of color this year.
Wow.
And
not just by police, but in society at large.
In society at large. And I think we have to think about sort of at the height of Jim Crow era, how Black people were being murdered by vigilantes, right? For not being seen as human. And I think we're in this sort of time period right now where Black trans women we're in sort of a Jim Crow era around Black trans women, and how Black trans women are not seen as human. And the way that they're murdered is despicable. The way that the police respond is a form of state violence because it's often no response. And I would say that the way that Black trans women are invisible and the larger narrative around Black life mattering is also a problem. And so we've really put that as part of our conversations. Um, we're working in collaboration with TWOC, Trans Women of Color Collective, that's head up by Lords Ashley Hunter. We're calling it the blueprint on how we should be having this movement for all Black lives. And I think that also this conversation around state violence needs to be broadening. Right now, the movement is focused on law enforcement, which I think is important. But we have to also open up the banner around what we talk about and what sort of programs we're trying to look at for Black people.
And that addresses those larger issues of poverty,
Exactly.
education, et cetera, that you were talking about.
Exactly.
I want to spend the last few minutes of our conversation on challenges within movement building. Several of them. One is there's been a conversation, I know, around white allies and the solidarity from white activists certainly, being important. There's a lot of white folks holding the sign, like Chris Magnus, the police officer, but ordinary white folks holding Black Lives Matter sign. And then there's also this fear of co-optation. And I'm wondering how important it is. There was one response to Black Lives Matter called hashtag criming while white, where some white folks on Twitter were posting how they experienced personally the double standards from law enforcement, how they were able to get off scot-free when it was clear that they were committing crimes, as a way to show that they were able to see these double standards. What are your thoughts on those things?
I mean, we did an entire workshop called Solidarity is a Verb. And we asked ally communities to come and talk about what it would look like to take on the banner Black Lives Matter. There's been a new hashtag Asians for Black Lives that came out about a week ago. That's being head up by a group of Asians from across the country. And there was an occupation of the Oakland Police Department. It was huge. It was both Black folks and their allies. And there was very clear the role that allies play. And I think part of the conversation of Black Lives Matter has been really being clear what role we want our allies to play in this. And Canada, there's a Black Lives Matter chapter out there. They did a really good job at sort of listing when you're in public protest, have Black folks be in the front, have Black folks talk to the camera people. This is part of your fight because you're helping us fight for Black lives, but this isn't your moment to sort of shine and be on camera and still the quote show. So I think that allies play an important and distinctive role, and we think they're necessary, and we're really pushing them to take our lead.
And these are similar issues that came up, for example, during the civil rights movement. There were a lot of white activists in the civil rights movement, arm in arm with Black activists walking the streets. Some of them gave their lives alongside Black activists as well. So it is important for Americans to see this. The other issue that seems to be emerging is a sort of generational, I'm not sure if I want to use the word divide, but maybe conversation. A lot of people like to hate on Al Sharpton. He has been front and center, sometimes showing up within days of a killing by a police officer, leading a lot of the marches, but still he is there. Would you have any thoughts or any opinions about Al Sharpton and the role that he plays?
I don't know if it's a generational divide, because we have a lot of elders that we work with, right? We have elders in Black Lives Matter that we think are great, and I think it's much more about Reverend Al Sharpton not allowing for the folks who've been on the ground to lead the conversation.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about that, Jasmine?
I would agree with Patrisse. It's just about him stifling the voices of the young people. And it's like they've been out here occupying those streets, you know what I mean? And then you just come in and just go off with it. So I feel like who made Al Sharpton our leader?
And there was a major demonstration in Washington, D.C. just over a week ago where some of the younger activists had to sort of strong-arm their way onto the microphone because they hadn't been invited to speak.
Yes.
And
that's a problem. It's a problem with the people who literally we owe this moment in time to the people of Ferguson and St. Louis. They've been on the ground now 130 plus days. They were tear gassed, they were rubber bulleted, and they stayed out there. And it ignited the entire country and now the entire world. And so for Reverend Al Sharpton to not invite any of them to come speak is rather disrespectful. And it's confusing because how does he imagine people are going to want to follow his lead? And at this point in history, we've made it really clear there is no one leader. This is a decentralized movement. There are many of us working on many things. We have our rallying call is Black Lives Matter, and we want to build local power. There are some federal and national demands that we have, but large in part, this is not the Al Sharpton movement. This is the Black Lives Matter movement.
So there's also this sense that the civil rights movement's approach to civil disobedience and nonviolent civil disobedience in particular is the magic bullet approach to fixing these problems. Some younger activists say, like you were mentioning earlier, Jasmine, that sometimes the only way to get the attention of media is to get a little aggressive, but that may, rub some people's feathers the wrong way. So is that also a conversation that's happening, a sort of challenge within the movement that people are trying to come to terms with?
Yeah, I think a few things. The civil rights movement wasn't sort of this monolithic movement, right? Yeah. The Black Panther Party came out of the civil rights movement. One of the most clear, the most, I don't want to use aggressive, but militant, right? Organization. And a lot of us are still utilizing that framework of militancy. And so I think that's important that we remember there's whole other models for us. And the other thing I would say is, Tef Poe says it in one of his songs, this isn't your grandparents' civil rights movement. This is our movement, and we're trying to figure it out. We're taken from the old, and we're also trying to figure out, we have new conditions, new issues. We're trying to figure out what that means to us.
It's a different world today.
Totally.
Right. Well, I want to thank the two of you so much for spending this time with us. What's the best website that people can find for your organization, Twitter feeds that you recommend they follow?
BlackLivesMatter.com, but then our LA, we have a Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And as Jasmine continues and building up the Pasadena chapter, they'll have their own social media as well.
And there are many chapters around the country.
There's about 10 chapters across the country and one in Canada.
That's blacklivesmatter.com. I want to thank you both so much.
Thanks
again,
so much.
Patrisse Cullors and Jasmine Richards. Thanks so much. Best of luck to the both of you.
Thank you so much.
This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and our program director, and Anna Buss, our media intern, sitting in for Bipasha today. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Christian Beck is our production intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Thanks so much for watching and listening. I'll see you tomorrow.